Tech Nuggets, Windows Remote Access and Remote Desktop Connections. Windows Remote Access. So Remote Desktop Client or Remote Desktop Protocol, known as RDC or RDP. Those are kind of the two acronyms that get kicked back and forth. It's a remote control of a GUI session on Windows or Linux. Not as often on Linux. This is a Microsoft product, so a lot of times you'll hear it called MS, RDP, RDC, because it's designed and created for Windows originally. But it has been ported to other operating systems. You can get clients for a variety of operating systems, and the server you can get for Linux and some other operating systems as well. Functionally, in the Linux world, you would see this as SSH combined with VNC. We would use SSH for the encryption and some of the credential management, and VNC for the GUI control of the remote machine. And RDP puts both of those together with encryption and credential management into RDP, RDC, Windows Remote Access. Those are the three terms. In the virtual world, we might call this a virtual desktop. We would use virtual desktop infrastructure, VDI. We could use RDP to connect to VDI sessions. That's a normal kind of thing. RDC allows the user to remotely control a PC. So you use your local machine and you start the RDC client and you remote in to the remote machine, and you can drive the remote machine just as if you were sitting in front of the keyboard and the monitor and the mouse in nearly every way. And I say nearly because there's a couple of things you can't do. RDP does a wonderful job with video resolution changes. So if you change the size of the window that RDP is running in, it will resize windows inside that and do a pretty good job with that. But it means that there are certain types of video access that don't work. For example, some like video games, high frame rate type things won't start, won't run. You can have some issues with that kind of stuff. Generally speaking, for general office use, it works really well. Word and browsers and all those kind of tools work really well. I've got several examples where I have to be sitting at a specific machine for security reasons that let me into other places inside that network, and I can RDP into that machine, and it's as if I'm sitting at that machine running the browser, issuing commands, command windows. All my software is there because it's everything that's set up when I've logged into that machine. So once you get it all doctored up, it's kind of nice. Not all versions of Windows have an RDC server options. All editions of Windows and many other operating systems have a client. So being a client and going to something, iOS, Android, Chrome, Windows, Linux, nearly everything will have a client so that you can go remoting from that device to a Windows machine. However, to be able to be a server, Windows 10 Pro, Windows 10 Enterprise, all the versions of Windows Server. I'm not sure about Windows Home Server. That's not completely true. I believe it has RDP server in it as well, but I'm not sure. Windows 10 Home does not have the server. You cannot remote in using RDP that way. It doesn't allow for that. There are some network considerations to think about when you're doing this kind of thing. The remote machine must have an RDP server installed and listening for connections. The machine will have a local firewall. Windows, again, is really good about understanding its own firewall, but if you have a third-party firewall, you'll need to open the right ports to let it do that kind of stuff. Most machines at home and at work have a firewall and oftentimes a NAT blocking connections from the outside in to local machines, and that's generally really good. We don't want the outside world to be able to reach in and touch our workstations. There are some ways to set up machines, both in the firewalls and routers and NATs, to allow connections through that security to make an RDP connection. And it is complicated enough that I will likely do another Tech Nugget on how to do that because it is a little complex. Looking here, we're going to talk a little about how do I turn on remote desktop if I have a version of Windows that supports it. And for the most part, you would go to the settings, and under the search bar, you'd search for remote desktop settings. And there's a little slider, just like in the picture I've showed here, and you flip the slider to on, and you should be good. There's a couple of limitations here. You're going to have to be somebody when you log in. So you're going to need to know your username and password, and you're probably going to have to give it some credentials on how do I do that. And there are a number of websites, Google search, Google is your friend, to go figure out how to do that kind of stuff. And you may need to go look into how do I go do that and allow that user the right to come in and not just be a local user at the local keyboard, but also be an RDP remote desktop user. This is the client side. So this is what it's going to look like for Windows remote desktop connection client. So when I want to go from my machine to somewhere else, how does that work? And in the Windows search, you're going to search for remote desktop connection and run it, and it's going to start a little application that looks just like this. There are a number of options. The only one we need to have is a destination. And in this case, I use the IP address because I know it's specific and correct. We can use a host name, but host names can resolve in different ways in different places depending on your environment. A unique IP address that's globally unique will be the same all the time. Again, we're making assumptions that there's no firewalls in the way and that the server has been configured and turned on appropriately. So once the connection's established and you've put in the IP address and hit connect, it's going to prompt you for, username and password. We call that cred. Who are you? What? And it's got to be on the remote machine, not on your local machine of who are you? So you're going to need to set some of that stuff up ahead of time, or if you're provided a session, they'll have to provide those kinds of things for you. All right, let's go on to the practical demonstration. So I've gone ahead and created two virtual machines using VMware Workstation. One is local workstation, which is what we're looking at here. It has the blue background, and I've run in a piece of software here that gives us updated information on what's going on. So we can see its username and its host name and its IP address and a bunch of other stats about the box. And I've created a second one called Remote Workstation, which has a different username, a different name. I created a green background, and that way you'll be able to tell the difference between the different machines, but please note it also has a different IP address, along with a bunch of other things. So we've got two separate Windows workstation environments that we're working with here. And so to remote from one to the other, we will type remote. It'll find remote desktop connection, and we'll click on it. It'll open the client. So you can see I've typed in the address of remote workstation and the username Rufus, and if I hit the little show options button here, I can change those options and things like that. There are a variety of settings up here. The most important one is display. You can change how big all the way up to and including full screen. But you can change how big it is. You can even, if you have multiple monitors, RDP will use multiple monitors to display the remote session. In this case, I've picked a window so that we can see both the local machine and the remote machine at the same time, but I will demo both here in just a second. So I put the IP address in. I put in a username. If I don't put in a username, it should prompt me for it when I hit connect. And it knew Rufus because I'd done some testing earlier. And I put in Rufus's password. If I check the Remember Me button, it'll never ask again. It'll just use the Rufus credentials, and so you can have it do that if you like. The first time you do it, there'll be a certificate discussion. Hey, I found certificates and blah, blah, blah. Windows is very certificate oriented. This is normal for this kind of thing. You can say accept it. You can check the little box and it'll go away and it won't ask again. You could import the certificate if you wanted. Generally speaking, this is not necessary. Most of the time I check the little box and move on. If you're using certificates in your environment, you'll want to check to make sure, if you get this, that you're using the right certificates. All right, and there we go. It makes its connection. It gives the Rufus machine the username and password that we gave it. And you can see here I've got a window showing Windows inside of Windows. It's sort of an inception discussion. This gives us full control over the machine. We can pretty much do anything with it that we would do with a normal machine. You can even remote desktop from the remote machine to somewhere else if you needed to. I've done that often when I can get into one machine and it lets me hopscotch along to other machines. Again, very similar to SSH. If we move over and look at our remote machine's local console, so I'm going to switch VMs here, it's locked. That's the standard Windows lock screen. So it locks the remote console, this is back to the local workstation, so that only one person can be working with it at a time. If I were to unlock remote workstation, it would kick us out of the RDP session. So only one person can have control of the console session at a time. If somebody's logged in, when you go to use it, it will give 30 seconds for the remote user to say yes or no. If the machine's locked, not logged out, but locked, it'll just let you right in because nobody's at it. It's locked, and Windows knows that. We're going to do one more where I do a full screen here. This is kind of an interesting thing. By default, your client will start like this unless you go play around with it. And oftentimes, full screen is great because it just takes over the whole machine and it's like you're sitting right in front of it. So we'll hit connect and we'll type our password and it'll take over. And now it looks just like I'm sitting at remote machine. You see this little bar at the top where I can pin it so the little bar doesn't go away, or I can unpin it and we'll see some network connection info, right? And you'll notice the bar went away. And if I put my mouse right back up at the top, it'll come back. I can turn it into a window. I can minimize it so I can get back to my local workstation. I can put it back up. You know, we can turn it into a window. I can kill it, right? That'll kill the connection, that kind of stuff. So if I'm done, you know, we just hit the button and it goes away. We can do this same thing to get to Linux machines if they're running an RDP server. There's a very nice one called XRDP, which is a Linux GUI RDP server. We use that a lot. Functions the same way. It's very useful. I hope you've enjoyed our Tech Nugget for the day on remote desktop and Microsoft Remote Access. Tune in for more Tech Nuggets. There'll be more.